President Cyril Ramaphosa expressed his disappointment at rich countries who hoarded the much-needed COVID-19 vaccines. He emphasized that the manufacturing of vaccines on the continent will be the fastest way to get access to life-saving medication to protect South Africans. In response to this, a group of health experts under the African Vaccine Manufacturing Accelerator on Thursday launched in Paris at the Global Forum for Vaccine Sovereignty and Innovation. For more on this now, we take Aspen's Group Senior Executive, Stavros Nicolau, on Teams. Mr. Nicolau, thank you for your time on the agenda. So this is a very important event. Can you just perhaps share some details on this for us?
Firstly, good morning to all the viewers, and thanks very much for having me. This is a very important meeting, and I think just to give a very brief high-level background, all viewers will remember that COVID shone a very bright and uncomfortable spotlight on the vast health inequality, the resource inequality that existed globally. Of course, we all know that Africa couldn't receive some very basic medicines that were needed during COVID. I think India imposed export bans on the African continent and beyond. Europe was hoarding vaccines, as you said. And it came to a really critical phase when we started seeing unnecessary lives and livelihoods were lost in Africa. And in many respects, Africa is still struggling to recover post the pandemic, economically speaking. As a consequence of that, there was a call from the continent. President Ramaphosa led the charge at the time that the continent needs to establish its own capacities and capabilities. You simply cannot rely on others when you're faced with a pandemic. Now, that was around 3 years ago. And if I fast forward to Paris today, and yesterday was a historic announcement in many respects, but in some respects, still outlies the huge amount of work that needs to be done. So what was yesterday? Yesterday was a coming together of 10 heads of state. 8 of them were from Africa. Of course, President Macron presided over proceedings. And I must say Macron was probably, of all the European leaders, the most proactive, calling for vaccines for Africa at the time. So that's probably why he convened the meeting here in Paris. It had all the donors, including the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, and others, and many European countries and the United States in the form of President Biden's office pledged. They made big pledges towards this AVMA. Now, what is this AVMA? It stands for the African Vaccine Manufacturers Accelerator, and it's a $1 billion facility that Gavi is making available. Gavi is the Global Vaccine Alliance. It's making it available to support African manufacture of vaccines. So it all sounds very promising, but there's one little detail here that's really important. And that detail is that what African facilities, manufacturing facilities need, they need volumes, they need orders through their facility, because if you don't get the orders, there's no demand, then these facilities shut down. And when the next pandemic comes around, then you are ill prepared again. And we've seen this with Mpox. We've just seen a second patient die from Mpox in South Africa, and we don't have our own vaccines. So there's a lot of work to be done. And the real test for me of whether the AVMA is a successful instrument or not is if we start seeing the procurement agencies, this is Gavi, UNICEF, and the continent itself. Until and unless we see them starting to place orders away from Asia towards African manufacturers, then I will say we are on the right pathway and are on the road to success. And for me, that is the measure. So in summary, yesterday was a big event, a lot of global support for it. Unfortunately, our own government couldn't attend because of the inauguration. A lot of excitement, but much work lies ahead. And that work for me is are we going to land orders and volumes in African manufacturing facilities so that we sustain and develop our own manufacturing capacities on the African continent.
And Mr. Nicolau, just of course using yesterday as the building blocks to all of this, you've highlighted some of the stark inequalities that we continue to see till today, and the gaps as well, if you may. What sense are you getting where you are from your vantage point? Do you think we are advancing beyond paying just lip service and something will be done to benefit the African continent in all of this?
So to be frank with you, we're at the stage where I think in the next 3 months, we will see whether this is lip service or not. I say that because, I keep referring to what is the measure of success. The measure of success here is if this is a manufacturing accelerator for Africa, it means you're going to accelerate the putting up of capacities. In many instances, in Aspen's case, we have these capacities already. So what we are waiting to see in the next 3 months is, will there be orders directed towards African manufacturing facilities? During what period and over what period of time? And what are the quantities? So there's an ambitious target, but maybe not so ambitious, a realistically ambitious target, let me call it that has been set by the African Union. And again, President Ramaphosa led the charge on this. That presently we produce 1% of our vaccines on the African continent, and we have to import the other 99%. So you can see how vulnerable and exposed we are. I'm referencing, Mpox again. And the target is to move to 30% local production in Africa by 2030, and then 60% by 2040. Now, if we're still sitting at 1% and we are 5 years away from the first target, we're going to have to do a lot of catching up and accelerating. So I think the next 3 months are crucial to see how the procurement agencies now react to this. So here I'm talking about Gavi, I'm talking about UNICEF, and I'm talking about the governments on the continent as well, buying from local African producers. I think if we start seeing momentum and movement around it, then I think we could probably say we're moving away from lip service. But the jury's out, I'm afraid.
And we'd also have to move it forward, Mr. Nicolau, and maybe just find out, and have conversations, rather open and honest conversations on how can Africa strengthen its capacity for vaccine production.
Look, I think what is critical and underpins any sustainability is you have to have sustainable volumes. We've seen many times in Africa facilities being put up, there's no demand, and governments continue to import these products, and then the facility shut down. We're quite different at Aspen because we have a global business, but you do invest in these capacities, and underpinning and underscoring any sustainability conversation is you have to have sustainable, consistent and regular volumes and predictable volumes through manufacturing facilities, because that's what's going to give us economies of scale. So what are we trying ultimately to achieve here? We are trying to set up these capacities and capabilities in Africa in the first instance, and in the second instance, make them sustainable. But thirdly, we seek the volume so we get economies of scale so we can compete on our own 2 feet against the Asians, the Europeans, the Americans and others. Because that is presently where if I were to say colloquially, Africa has outsourced all of its volumes. 99% of its volumes have been outsourced. We need to get those back. And you can only get those back if you build up those economies of scale and you're able to compete against the others. And that remains the target here.
And Mr. Nicolau, just before I let you go, I'm going to squeeze in something before we wrap up our conversation. South Africa is, of course, waiting on the announcement on the new government. Have you been having talks there with some of the guests? Any reaction to what is currently happening right now in South Africa?
So I think there are two reactions. The first thing is I got to speak to yesterday David Cameron, who is the British Secretary of State. I got to speak to President Macron's team, a few other heads of state. They are watching very closely and carefully what is going on in South Africa. I think they're encouraged. Certainly, David Cameron was encouraged with the developments, the Government of National Unity. He's keeping a very close watch on it. The UK, Britain is a partner of South Africa's. The reaction from the Africans was also very positive. But I might add just secondly that many of these countries are facing their own elections. So here where I am in France today, President Macron called for a snap election, and that's going to happen next weekend is the first round. So there's a lot of angst and I suppose anxiety in France at the moment as to which way this is going to go. So in the UK, we know that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has called a snap election, which is coming up, and just speaking to some delegates, it's expected, delegates yesterday, it's expected there might be a change in the UK government as well. So this is not a phenomenon unique to South Africa, because I've just mentioned two countries that are G7 countries who are both likely, or certainly in the case of the UK, it seems could have a new government. So it's not unique to our country, but the news around South Africa, the Government of National Unity, has been very positively received in the circles that I spoke to yesterday. And I think the markets have reacted positively as well. So generally, it's a positive message coming out of South Africa.
Aspen's Group Senior Executive, Stavros Nicolau, thank you so much indeed for your time on the program.